Okay, so this mixing hack is going to focus on the multiband dynamics effect in Ableton Live. And the goal in this one is to use this device to add some space to a loop. I like using drum loops, but a lot of times when I do use drum loops, there might be some extra junk in there or just like noise or things that I don't really need. And the type of music I make, I like to keep things very dynamic and bouncy. So sometimes I like to use dynamics processing to bring out some more dynamics rather than squash dynamics out of a signal. So it's kind of like using compression and things like that in reverse, where we're making something more dynamic rather than making it less dynamic. And I found this to be a helpful technique when you do want to open up space in something. Now I'm going to be using a drum loop for this example, but feel free to try it on anything. But we will just have a quick little overview of the multiband dynamics effect here. If you haven't seen it yet, this does pop up in another one of our mixing hack videos. But in essence, what it is it's three separate dynamic processors in one. You have a compressor and an expander that's going to operate on a low band of frequencies for the sound. In this case, it's anything under 120 hertz. A high band of frequencies in the sound, which is everything above 2.5 kilohertz here. And then the mid-range is everything in between that. So I chose this drum loop. This is from Ableton's core library because it's a good loop. But if you listen to it, there's not much space, and you can even kind of see in the waveform, there's not really any clear, distinct space between where these drums are hitting. It's pretty much constant noise. Yeah, we do have some peaks and valleys here and there. But I would like to open up some more of the space and make the transients a little more punchy, make the valleys between the transients a little lower, I should say, lower in amplitude, and create some more space. So the way we're going to do this is not necessarily to use this in a traditional compressor type of a way, but actually I want to use these three below thresholds that are over here on the left-hand side of the multiband dynamics. So the multiband dynamics is divided into two separate areas or two separate groups of thresholds. So we have these three over here. These are called your below thresholds, and then you have the above thresholds over here. And for example, if I wanted to compress maybe my low end for my signal here, I could set the above threshold. And if I now move my mouse into the middle of this box and I click and drag down, what we're doing is we're applying some traditional downward compression. So we're kind of turning the volume down of the low end as it goes over this threshold and then releasing it as it goes back sort of below that threshold. So this is how a compressor is going to work in a traditional sense. And if you want to have a little bit more control over it, again, I'm using the above threshold for the low end. So if I click this A button here, this is going to show me that threshold level. It's now at minus 17.5 dB. And then we have our ratio here, and as I click and drag, I can adjust that. You can see these bars on the above threshold area start to get closer and closer together as I increase the threshold. So now we're at a 4:1. I'm sorry, as I increase the ratio. So at a 4:1, 16:1, we can go to infinity to 1, essentially limiting the signal there. But we're just pressing it down and squashing the dynamics down as we use this traditional downward compression. So I don't necessarily want to use traditional downward compression for this example. What we want to do is work in the opposite direction. We want to use these below thresholds. So let's reset this to a 1:1 ratio, meaning essentially that it's not doing any dynamics processing to the low end. And we want to use these below thresholds. And what this allows us to do is, as a signal falls below the threshold here, and if I click the B button, we can see the threshold level. So let's set it somewhere where we see this high band. If you want to hear what's going on in the high band, we can solo it. Let's set it somewhere so the high band is moving both above and below that below threshold. Now what's going to happen here is when the signal falls below that threshold, we can tell it to do one of two things. We can click and drag up to start to do what's called upward compression, meaning that the signal's falling below this, but we're saying, you can't get lower than this, and we're kind of pushing it back up. This is what something like the very famous, let's go to the audio effects category in the browser here, the very famous OTT preset that I see so many producers using. It's using a little bit of upward and downward compression on all three bands to kind of keep everything nice and tight. Let's hear how it sounds on this drum loop actually. Keep everything just squashed into a nice tight little box, which can sound great on some sounds. It could sound horrible on some sounds. Like this drum loop I think is way less attractive than it was. But anyway, going back to our default multiband dynamics that we're editing here, so we can upward compress by clicking and dragging upward, or what I actually want to do for this loop, because we want to open up space, that's the goal for this video, we want to click and drag downward. And what we're going to do here is notice the ratio level, which is showing right here. When I start to click and drag down, I start to get these values below 1 to 1. And when we start to see that, you see how the box kind of turns bluish here, bluish green. And as I turn that down, what we're doing is downward expansion. So what's happening here is we're telling the signal when it falls below this threshold to drop very drastically in volume. So therefore, only the peaks of the high end, only the tippy tops of the hi-hats and the snares and whatever else is going on in this drum loop are going to come through. But when it gets quiet enough, when after the transient hits and then it starts to fall in volume, it's going to drop down very significantly, in essence opening up some space for us. So let's reset this to 1 to 1 so we don't hear any dynamics processing yet. We've set our threshold level accordingly. And let's start to click and drag downwards to do a bit of downward expansion. Keep going here. Let's go pretty drastic with it, as low as we can go. Okay, now if we want to, we can use this button here to bypass the dynamics processing. If I turn that off, we'll hear how the high end originally sounded. So this is everything in that drum loop above 2.5 kilohertz again. And if I turn it back on, we can hear the difference of what we've done here. So we just really hear the peaks. We lose a little bit of the tail end of the sounds, but I notice that's where a lot of white noise and this kind of, there's some junk in this drum loop we're kind of getting rid of by doing that. So let's unsolo this and hear the whole band, or all 3 bands I should say, of the frequencies all together. And hopefully you're starting to hear the difference there. So here it is with the multiband dynamics off, our dry signal. Let's apply the processing, the downward expansion. Now that high end is a lot cleaner, but I'm noticing, let's solo this mid-range. The mid-band is pretty junky as well. So let's do something similar here. Let's set our below threshold. Let's find a spot where the level's moving both above and below, so we get a little bit of up-down action here, because we want to catch the peaks of whatever's hitting in the mid-range. So you can hear it's like the body of the snare drum. We get a little bit of the lower part of the hi-hats. And again, let's start to downward expand a little bit. So we're going to click and drag down. By the way, if you want to adjust the attack and release times of these dynamic processes, you can see here I have a 10 millisecond attack time. Below that is the release time, which is 200 milliseconds. You can adjust that by clicking this T button. This will show us the times for attack and release for the processing. To be honest with you though, the default settings work pretty well for this stuff. So I don't even know if I'll need to touch it. Okay, so let's bring this, again, we'll go as low as we can go. We'll go really extreme with it. And let's hear the difference. So we'll bypass the what we're doing to the mid-range. You can hear all that white noisy stuff starting to build up. And now this loop, or this mid-range at least, sounds a lot more open. Let's hear everything. Now let's A-B, bypass. You can hear the full loop, all noise, all tails of hi-hats, all tails of snares, etc. And then we'll turn it on. Much more punchy loop. We got a lot more open space. We got a lot more peak and valley action happening between these different drum hits in this loop. And by opening that space, if we were going to use this loop in a full track, we can start to input things like bass notes in between the drum hits, or chord stabs, or other lead notes. So as you can see and hopefully hear, just by simply using the downward expansion process in the multiband dynamics, we're able to create a lot more openness, a lot more dynamic movement in this drum loop, where before there wasn't as much. And one last tip I'll leave you with here is, if you bypass the high and the low bands in the multiband dynamics, now it's no longer a multiband dynamic processor. Now it's just working over a single band or over the entire sound. So if you just want to apply just a global downward expansion to everything in that particular audio loop or audio file that you're using, you can do this. But I do find that it can be helpful just to isolate the frequencies and process those independently. But try both, see what works, and hopefully this technique helps you open up some space in your sounds, create a little bit more dynamic movement and punch, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Take care.